Please tell us if there is such a science as geopolitics. Because some people believe that there is geopolitics. It exists. It is objective. While others say that geopolitics is not a science. It is not clear what, only manipulation of social consciousness.
Yes, this is a serious question. Let us begin with the fact that the word geopolitics exists and has even been published. Geopolitics Anthology. There are a lot of bookmarks here, but I'll tell you right away, not my bookmarks. 1,000 pages of text. What does it have? Geopolitical thought of ancient Greece and Rome. There are Athenian politicians, Philip's political speeches, Plato's The Republic, Aristotle Politics, Cicero Dialogues, Julius Caesar, Notes of Caesar and his successors. Well, and so on to the present day, including Mehan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Karl Haushofer's works on geopolitics. Well, you can't do without Zbigniew Brzezinski, The Grand Chessboard, Henry Kissinger, Does America Need a Foreign Policy, and much more. And in general, this is such a thick book. So, in Soviet times, geopolitics was regarded as one of the bourgeois pseudosciences. As a bourgeois pseudoscience, they say, by different natural geographical conditions, it substantiated the need for the expansion of the imperialist states and their aggressive politics with the objective of establishing world domination by the most powerful of them. Well, there is no Soviet Union. Marxism is not a dogma or even a guide to action, but has remained in the past for the majority of the population. The word geopolitics has come into common use. Wikipedia says something about geopolitics, that it works with such problematics as state control over the territory, the establishment of spheres of influence outside their state borders by the state, or by some kind of blocks of states, and the competition of these very states and blocks for control over these or those territories and spheres of influence. There are a lot of books and works on this theme. In general, they have a lot of things. But the question arises, what is absent in them? Because what is absent in them is more important than the many texts of all the authors who wrote on various themes about the state and politics of the state, whose works are compiled into similar books, sometimes without any reason to be included in these books.
Подчас без всяких к тому оснований, чтобы их включать в эти книги.
The word geopolitics consists of two roots. Geo is the earth, and the term earth can be understood by everyone to the measure of the breadth of their horizons. For some, it is 6 acres, for others, it is the whole planet. But politics is a plurality of interests. Since interests are conflicting, then interests must be governed. And therefore, a look into history from the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, and a look from the same position at modernity and at the prospects, allows one to see a lot of that which cannot be seen without mastering its theoretical apparatus and without correlating with its conceptual apparatus what happens in life. So, politics is a plurality of interests. The regulation of these interests must be governed. Statehood is a system for governance towards the affairs of society on a professional basis, and the state is a territory and population that live under the power of statehood and which reproduce this statehood. Now, if we decide on this, then it turns out that in the politics of the state, three components can be distinguished.
Это преследование тех или иных целей в пределах собственной юрисдикции.
Internal politics. This is the pursuit of these or those objectives within the boundaries of its own jurisdiction. External politics. This is the pursuit of these or those objectives in relation to other states, either alone or in alliance with some other states. Well, we can also single out the third component of politics, global politics. This is the pursuit of these or those objectives in relation to global civilization as a whole and humanity as a whole. If such a classification of the entire stream of state politics is accepted, then it turns out that many politicians and political analysts are eager to talk about internal politics in all its aspects, about external politics in all its aspects, and few people talk about global politics, especially if the term global politics appeared after the introduction into circulation of the term geopolitics, whatever they insert into it. The appearance of the term global politics shows that there are people who see a certain difference between that which is covered under the label geopolitics throughout, well, at least the 20th century and its second half and further, and that which global politics as such represents. Politicians around the world are divided into two categories. Some say geopolitics, while others sometimes use the term global politics, although they do not explain it and do not emphasize its content differences from the term geopolitics. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin sometimes uses the term global politics in the context in which its appearance is appropriate, but he never explains what it is, and they don't ask him what it is. Among the articles that are in this collection, there is an article on the theme of globalization. And then, if we again look at globalization from the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then geopolitics can be understood as a synonym for the term global politics, with the proviso that an intelligible content is introduced there and demagoguery is gotten rid of. Well, the intelligible content boils down to what globalization is, whether governance towards it is carried out from intrasocial levels, whether this governance is alternativeless, or it is variable, and accordingly we and the state have the right to choose one or another conception of globalization and implement it, both in our global politics and in internal and external politics, in accordance with how these terms, internal, external, and global politics, were defined by me earlier. This all is a kind of introduction. However, geopolitics in the form in which it has taken shape to date, it does not deal with this problematics. Everything remains at the level of competition between states and blocs with each other, in the aspect of building spheres of influence, ousting opponents from their spheres of influence, and taking them under control. And about what is happening at a higher level. About this, geopolitics in its historically taken shape form does not say anything. Next question. If you look at the development of geopolitics as a kind of collection of texts claiming to be scientific, what is the difference between scientific texts and non-scientific texts? Scientific texts should, after all, intelligibly express those objective laws that are manifested in the corresponding sphere of activity, and should lead an intelligible narration about how to build an activity relying on these laws. Therefore, whatever the Marxists said in their time, nonetheless, geopolitics really has an objective basis, like the difference in natural geographic conditions in different regions of the planet. These differences dictate, at the early stages of ethnogenesis, the economic structure, either nomadic or sedentary. The sedentary way of life allows the development of the technosphere and scientific technological progress. Further, there take shape some cultural characteristics of each of the people, as a result of which scientific technological progress is either generated by this people, or the people, over the course of a long time, import the achievement of scientific technological progress from outside their territory, but maybe sometimes introducing some contribution into the development of this very scientific technological progress. But we looked at this side when I talked about scientific implementational cycles as a random process and how it is introduced. Well, further, if you look at the development of geopolitics as a collection of texts claiming to be scientific, it turns out that the authors, until probably the end of the first third of the 20th century, wrote about geopolitics mainly as a military power confrontation. After the Second World War, they began to write about geopolitics as an economic confrontation. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they began to write about geopolitics as a cultural confrontation, the use of so-called soft power, the essence of which boils down to the fact that other people must be persuaded to live in accordance with their norms. Now, if we correlate with the hierarchy of generalized means of governance, which is proposed by the conception of social safety, then the first stage in the development of geopolitics is thinking at the level of only the sixth priority of generalized means of governance, military confrontation. When they began to write about geopolitics as economic processes spilling over the borders of certain states, this was a rise to the level of the fourth priority of generalized means of governance, and partly the third, since everything that happens in the field of economics is interpreted in one way or the other through those economic theories that are characteristic of this or that society. And in this respect, Galbraith's work, Economics and the Public Purpose, is interesting. In it he shows one important component of all economic theories, an important in the cultural regard component.
Одну важную составляющую всех экономических теорий, важную в культурном отношении составляющую.
Economic theories explain how the economy functions in a plausible way, developing a like-mindedness and the same attitude towards the ongoing processes. But the question of the reliability of these explanations does not arise therewith. But such a world understanding, is convenient for these or those political forces, and it allows them to do their job and manipulate the rest of society. But when geopolitics began to be understood as, first of all, the use of soft power, that is, means of impacting the culture of other peoples, and to this means of impact, the economy and military power turn out to be subordinate, then, in general, geopolitics in its development has risen onto the level of the third priority of generalized means of governance. Well, since it does not touch upon such questions as ethics and the solution of ethical problems by peoples and mankind, by the method of successive approximations, which is expressed in repetition of destiny and of history. Well, for example, Napoleon and Hitler. There's a lot in common in biographies with a difference of 129 years. President Lincoln and President Kennedy. A lot in common in biographies with a difference of about 100 years. With us, the era of the time of troubles at the turn of the 16th, 17th centuries, and the present time also have a lot in common, including in the personal biographies of many participants in the events of that era and the current era. This is, in essence, the historical algorithmic priority, which is expressed in chronology. Many possibilities, it is usually multivariate. But out of all the many variants in history, only one is realized, and the chronology of events is a kind of marker that separates different variants and paths of development. But in order to see all of this, it is necessary to rise to the first priority of generalized means of governance, where that section of philosophy, which is called gnoseology, resides. And unfortunately, in all societies, people are brought up in such a way that when they hear the word gnoseology, they try to get out of the audience as quickly as possible. Texts on this theme suffer from a common defect in humanitarian disciplines. They are almost impossible to correlate with what happens in the psyche of a person when he is engaged in cognitive creative activities. And the circumstance that gnoseology factually became a bogeyman in one aspect, and in another aspect, an effective functionally operable gnoseology or methodology of cognition, became the lot of those clans that carry these or those esoteric traditions, stand outside public politics, but in one way or the other manipulate this public politics. Without this understanding, it is impossible to turn geopolitics into a science that would really rely on the objective laws of being of human society and would allow, relying on these objective laws, to govern the life of human society. Objective laws in the materials of the conception of social safety have been mentioned more than once. The first group of objective laws is pan-biospheric. They regulate the interaction of biological species with each other and regulate the interaction of the biosphere as a system with the natural environment that we perceive as dead, ossified matter, although this perception is far from always justified and substantiated. The second group of objective laws is the species-specific objective laws of the biological species Homo sapiens. If we talk about the former, then the main law of the fauna is that fertility is excessive in relation to the capacity of the ecological niche. By strength of this, the excess are destroyed by the mechanism of natural selection, which includes the eating of specimens by representatives of other species and intraspecific competition within the species itself, in its populations. If we talk about species specific, then a person is characterized by the fact that the ratio relationship of the mass of the brain of an adult specimen to the brain of a newborn is the highest in the biosphere. Therefore, we have the longest childhood, both in absolute terms and in relation to life expectancy. But since the process of upbringing is variative, then at the output, we can get a monkey with a grenade, and we can get a human. In between, there are such specific types as a zombie, a robot on the basis of the biomass of the species Homo sapiens, and a demon, also on the basis of the biomass of Homo sapiens, who is not limited by any ethical norms in its behavior. Further, there are objective laws of a noospheric religious character, which in their essence are Nravious ethical. A derivative of them is the culture of man and the culture of society. If by culture we understand all that information and algorithmics, that is, patterns of behavior that are passed from generation to generation over and above the genetic mechanism of the biological species. But if culture is understood this way, then culture is variative. Accordingly, if the culture is variative, then there are also many variants for globalization. But all conceptions of globalization are always a product of the methodology of cognition and creativity, that is, the first priority of generalized means of governance, passed through the nraviousness and ethics of the carriers of this methodology of cognition. Therefore, the question arises of the best conception of globalization, which would allow both the biosphere of the planet to exist stably and a person as a part of the biosphere of the planet to live stably, and would provide a minimum of intrasocial tension and, accordingly, maximum freedom for the life of each individual in society.
Максимальную свободу для жизни каждого индивида в обществе.
Now, if we turn to geopolitics in its historically taken shape form, all these problematics are out of context. Geopolitics in the form in which it is a product of Western culture. A product of the culture of Western regional civilization, it is such that, in general, it is believed that a taken-place human is a person of Western civilization. He is liberal, he is active, he is the leader of civilizational progress of the rest of humanity, everyone should imitate him, and so on and so forth. And it is recognized by the fact that if a person was born in the biological species Homo sapiens, raised not by a herd of monkeys or a pack of wolves, then he is a taken-place human, and he has the fullness of human rights. About responsibilities, no one talks. Well, except respect the rights of others, this is called tolerance. Well, in the end, globalization in the form in which the West offers it to the rest of humanity is a choice of a menu of catastrophes, and the collapse of global civilization. Variant 1. Peaceful existence, smooth development of the global biospheric ecological crisis, the collapse of the current biosphere, and there is no place for the species Homo sapiens in the new biosphere. A more severe variant, technogenic catastrophes, increase and kill civilization because things like Chernobyl, Bhopal, these are flowers compared to what may be with a further increase in power supply capacity and penetration into the secrets of chemistry, nanotechnology, and so on and so forth.
И проникновении в тайны химии, нанотехнологий и так далее и тому подобное.
Further, a well-fed paradise, when everything is there, but a person not taking place in the quality of human is removed from the action of the mechanism of natural selection. Then, biological degeneration, the collapse of a historically established culture, because new generations cannot carry the old culture. Well, further, there will be something like a nuclear war, or not a nuclear one, but a global technogenic catastrophe, or something else, or simply the degradation of the most advanced countries and the replacement of their populations with others who can either imitate the previous historical experience or show some kind of creativity and generate a qualitatively different civilization. Well, the simplest variant is the variant of war with the use of weapons of mass destruction, and further, as Einstein said, I don't know what will be used in the Third World War, but in the Fourth, bows and arrows. When there is a determined choice of determined variants, the individual says everything is unacceptable. There is a trap, because he does not refuse these variants. In reality, he chooses some alternative variant that he does not know. The rejection of the variants of these catastrophes in Western culture, this is the hope that the problems will somehow dissolve of their own accord. But if we turn to the history of Western civilization, then the dissolution of these problems, with them it always takes place in the mode of the fable about the Trishkin kaftan. One problem is solved on account of the fact that they created a new problem, and no one knows what to do with the new problem, but something needs to be done. Then again, someone appears and says, let's take resources from here, do this, we will solve this problem. But as a result, new problems arise, which are even worse and on a larger scale. What are the reasons for this? And the point is that cultures are different, not only in the aspect of the fact that in one place they cook pudding, and in the other they prefer cabbage soup, in the third they eat rice with chopsticks. Cultures differ in how they relate to the cognitive creative potential of a person. There are cultures that purpose-orientedly suppress the cognitive creative potential of a person, and unfortunately, the political subculture of post-Soviet Russia, more precisely, post-Stalinist Russia, is oriented on suppressing the cognitive creative potential of people, which found direct expression in the statement of the former Minister of Education and Science, Fursenko, on the theme that the problem of the Soviet school was that it created a person creator, but it was necessary to bring up a qualified consumer who uses the fruits of others. And we must pay tribute, during the reforms of the system of education in post-Soviet times, They succeeded in this in such a way that the secondary school massively produces, well, factually, morons. Because moron in the given case is not an insult, but a term that characterizes mild feeble-mindedness. Mild feeble-mindedness is expressed in how we understand what is behind the word think, cogitate. Now, if behind the word think, there is a skill that allows you to identify problems in the life of society and in the life of oneself, and independently work out consistent-to-life ways and methods for the solution of these problems. This is one way to think. And if to think is to combine something from the opinions of authorities that is logically non-contradictory, or logically contradictory, but not noticing these contradictions, thinking on the basis of texts and a verbal flow that is not correlated with life, then this is a different way to think. Moronism is expressed in the fact that the first way to think and cogitate, it turns out to be inaccessible to the individual. And the second way is the norm for him. Moreover, it should be borne in mind that the mass moronism that the Russian school produces is not the result of our children being biologically defective. Although those who are biologically defective as a result of the fact that their parents drank and smoked before conception and during pregnancy, and then in early childhood, including in the same room with a baby, such children are also many. But all the same, moronism is culturally conditioned, purpose-orientedly cultivated by the school on the basis of those educational technologies that have taken shape in it after the 1950s. But while this moronism is of a massive character, and in fact schools in Europe, America, post-Soviet Russia, this is a mass production of morons, so that hope that all the problems will somehow dissolve of their own accord, it is not realizable. It is not realizable for the simple reason that even if someone comes who will intelligibly relate about what the problems are, how they are interconnected, and in full detailedness will present the conception of overcoming them, so as not to generate new ones, then morons are not able to understand what he says, and they will send him back to his starting positions. That is, the task of overcoming the crisis of this globalization is of a completely different character. It is necessary to upbring children in such a way. It is necessary to give them such an education in order that they could think, cogitate. In the first sense, that is, identify problems in the life of society, in the sphere of their professional activities, and independently find ways and methods of solving them. Then it will be possible to say that society as a whole will, in a certain way, distribute its responsibilities of people in the social association of labor, and someone will work out an alternative conception of globalization, which will allow the solution of the problems created by the past history. And the rest will then be able to accept this conception of globalization. Everyone in his own place will be able to implement it in life, doing their own thing within the boundaries of their competence in the profession and within the boundaries of reachability in other social and everyday life aspects. That is, the strategy can be such. If we talk about the conceptions of globalization, then, you see, it turned out that after the collapse of the past global civilization, several regional civilizations emerged. which inherited something of the habits, patterns, and experiences of the past global civilization, and regional civilizations had a peculiarity for a long time, but none of them, in general, pondered on the unification of mankind. Because if we turn to the culture of the Vedic civilization in all its manifestations, in the Vedic, in the Buddhist, in the culture of national paganism of some peoples of Southeast Asia, then there the task is simple. The soul must break the chain of reincarnations and stay there, somewhere in other worlds, and no longer appear on earth. What is happening on earth is the problem of those who could not break the chain of reincarnations and must heroically endure their karma with humility and obedience without aggravating karma. How they will not aggravate their karma is their question. Well, in general, depending on which chronology to use. But according to the traditional chronology, in the order of 3,500 years ago, the Egyptians ceased to be socially previous and philanthropic. A phrase from the aphorisms of Kozma Prutkov, the Egyptians at one time were socially previous and philanthropic. And the Jretshood of ancient Egypt degraded and started a global project of subjugating the rest of mankind in the name of God. The result of this was the biblical culture. Biblical culture is two-leveled when viewed from the outside, because when looking through it, there is another, a certain esoteric level that does not apply to the representatives of public life of society. This is hidden information on the theme of how to manipulate everyone else. And in the aspect of publicness, the followers of Judaism are entrusted with two missions. The first is to buy up the entire planet with all its inhabitants, their property, on the basis of a monopoly on usury. And the second mission is to control the development of science and technology, that is, to decide what is truth and what is lie, regardless of whether certain statements about truth and lie are confirmed by the principle, practice is the criterion of truth. Why? Because in any conception of the life of society, science solves certain specific tasks. It serves governance precisely according to this conception. And if something is unacceptable for this conception, then regardless of whether it is true or not, it is declared a lie. That is why there is a scientific hierarchy that is authoritative, and its task is to do precisely this. The so-called traditional Christian culture, in all its varieties, this is a subordinate system, because for each thesis of Judaism, there is a response thesis of Christianity, and it is in general of a subordinate character. The doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, as the initial doctrine, and the doctrine of other churches in the name of Christ, well, in one way or the other, is based on the Nicene Carthaginian symbol of faith, in which, for obvious reasons, there is not a single phrase spoken by Christ which is in the Gospel.
What is the symbol of faith?
Orthodox prayer, I believe. Catholic prayer, creed. I believe in one God, and further much more, and ends with Amen. The symbol of faith does not contain anything that was said by Christ. But if the cognitive creative potential of culture is blocked, and the doctrine is elevated to the rank of an immutable truth, then the common man does not encounter the question how the doctrines of historically taken shape Christianity and Judaism differ from what was taught by the founders of world religions. And therefore, although all this is present in the text, scattered in grains throughout the volume of this text, it passes by the consciousness of the majority of people and does not oblige them to any activity, either in relation to themselves or in relation to society. Therefore, the biblical project, like the doctrine of buying up the world, has been working throughout memorable history. If we talk about Islam, then there is also no alternative project of globalization, just as there is none in the East. But the Quran contains pointers, the purpose of which is to show anyone who reads the Quran without prejudice as a message addressed to him personally on the theme of how to reach that level of personal development when the methodology of cognition becomes a realizable, effective skill, and everything can be done, including the project of globalization, alternative to the biblical one.
Why do you think that globalization is inevitable? Everyone can live in their own, so to speak, area, not touch others.
You can try to live, but the point is, if there is economic and cultural exchange, then such things are factors of globalization. Here is one of the striking examples on the theme of how globalization flows. The well-known song, based on the work of Alla Borisovna Pugacheva, Once There Was an Artist. What was the name of the artist?
Well, I read that it was Pirosmani.
Yes, it was Pirosmani. Pirosmani is a Georgian. Where did the actress come from? From Paris to Tiflis. Raymond Pauls honestly said that the melody is based on the Latvian folk melody, which is no one knows how old. That is, everyone involved in the emergence of this song never thought about globalization and did not think about the project of its implementation, about the construction of some kind of alternative project of globalization, blocking the incompatible project of globalization. But nonetheless, this song is a product of globalization like many other things that happen in culture. And the fact that now we are sitting in a room and are recording with a technique that is clearly not made in Russia. If we talk about the origin of this technique, then at the basis of the achievements of fundamental science, partly Western, partly Soviet, it is produced where? Somewhere in Asia. Then, in general, whether we like it or not, globalization flows by itself. It is an objective process. By virtue of the fact that mankind is biologically united, it as a whole in general has the same needs, in the aspect in which the needs are not conditioned by the concretics of the physical geographical condition in each region. There are cultural interactions. There is tourism, there is trade. That is, whether we like it or not, globalization is flowing.
Yes, but it flows only because we have, firstly, means of communication, and secondly, the means of delivery are very fast or very large, which allow transporting these goods back and forth.
This is a question about the rate in the course of globalization. Yes, if you are carrying 20 or 30 tons of cargo around the world on a caravel, and such caravels around the world are within 1,000. This is one rate of globalization. But if all this cargo of caravels is manifoldly multiplied and can be stacked on one container ship, and she will transport all this around the world, not in a few years, but in a few months, this is a different rate of globalization. And if you need to urgently deliver something, then an airplane arrives with a carrying capacity of several tens of tons. You stuff containers in there, and after a few hours, the consignee is incredibly happy. That is, the question is not whether globalization is flowing or not. It always flows. But the question is the rate of flow. The rate has increased on account of the fact that the energy supply capacity has increased in connection with the fact that new means of communication have appeared. But globalization is inevitably objective by virtue of the fact that humanity is biologically united and cultures are mutually penetrating.
But they can penetrate each other for a long time.
They can penetrate each other for a very long time. Moreover, some cultures can destroy other cultures. They can destroy the biomass that carries these cultures. And further, the question arises, does this process flow on its own, or does this process have curators who direct along a certain line? Now, if you analyze the texts of the Bible, and analyze them in different editions, then the conclusion is inevitable that there are curators, and curators inherit the hierarchy of the jretshood of ancient Egypt. Such is the conclusion. But from the point of view of the layman, this is nonsense, because I am a layman, I am intelligent, no one governs me. Where did the culture that formed me as I am come from? I don't think about this. But I'm just so intelligent myself, everything that does not fit into my prejudices does not exist or is a lie.
Yes, well, then what you said with regards to the layman is absolutely clear. And if I were conducting globalization, I would push the same cock and bull story into their minds, pour the same banana oil into their ears, that there is no global power, you yourself are intelligent, you're on your own.
Well, this is reflected here. Because here, nothing is said about globalization as an objectively inevitable phenomenon, about the subjectiveness of generating the conception of globalization and governance towards globalization according to the entire function. You see, when they say that the United States is a world power, and the rest of the world, in the prospects, is the colonies of the United States, then no one ponders over the fact that the United States is limitedly sovereign. They are conceptually powerless. They do something within the framework of the conception of globalization within which they were created as a project.
But they have been partially reworked.
Variations of the project are variations of the project. These are adaptations of it to concrete conditions of natural, geographical, and historical circumstances. A book on the subject of America's unacceptable history, it is also the same size and thickness. I didn't bring it today, but I have it. Americans sometimes study how they emerged, but do not move away from the cultic historical myth. But again, this does not go beyond the conception that is. And the conception that is, it says that a person, by the fact of birth and growing up in a cultural society, is a full-fledged human, regardless of the peculiarities of the culture and any humanitarian so-called circumstances. And if we proceed from the fact that, in his time, Diogenes did not play a fool, but, walking around the city during the day with a lantern, pointed out very important life circumstances, destiny carrying in relation to the life of all mankind? And to try to answer this question, then it turns out in such a way that the biblical project of globalization is oriented on ensuring that the bulk of the population of the planet would be carriers of the animal type of psyche structure. That is, everything is subordinate to instincts. The curators of the bulk of the population, its shepherds, are the behind the scenes, not public power of Freemasonry and the rabbinate. These are bred to the type of structure of the psyche of a zombie. Their task is to ensure the governance towards society, carriers of the animal type of the structure of the psyche. These guys, in turn, find themselves under the power of a very narrow circle of carriers of the demonic type of psyche structure. These are not bound by any circumstances, any ethical norms. Well, in relation to whom to be bound? Some are carriers of the animal type of psyche structure, others are zombies. What ethics can a demon have in relation to these guys? Within the boundaries of one's own corporation, a certain corporative ethics works there. And a human in this system, this is an antisocial element that has no place, and his task, without burdening the lives of others, is to self-liquidate as soon as possible or go somewhere to the side, into some ecological niche and sit there, and not get involved in how globalization flows.
And who are the authors of globalization? If we take that it is very much stretched out in time, it turns out that this is something not very human-like, which lives for a long time.
The question here is whether they live for a long time or control the process of reincarnation, or have mastered the technologies of integrating the memory of those who previously lived in their own memory, in addition to the process of reincarnation.
That is, it turns out that the child loads the memory of grandparents into himself.
Not necessarily grandparents, but specific people who had certain social functions outside the public hierarchy. When it's loaded, they say to him, "Oh, yes, in your past life you were the high jretz there and there." Well, then the question arises only about the following. Is Satan an invention of people, or is he really a subject that exists and acts from the time of the creation of the planet? Everyone answers this question in their own way, but this question also has to do with how globalization flows and whether an alternative is possible. Different faiths answer this question differently. Well, Scientologists say directly that the position of civilization as it is now is the result of the fact that an extraterrestrial civilization bombed the Earth in the Stone Age a long time ago, the legacy of which is a deep fear in the memory of many people, and all sorts of glass lenses identical to those that arise at the site of our nuclear tests, which are scattered all over the planet, but the memory of the present civilization does not say anything about their origin. Therefore, the question of the sources of globalization is a debatable question. Precisely of that globalization which now flows. But the question of what alternative globalization should be is a really relevant question, and to a lesser extent debatable. Because, in general, all 6 groups of objective laws to which the life of every human individual is subordinate objectively exist, and they are cognizable. And further, it turns out that if a person is variative in his development, then there is also a certain optimum among the entire plurality of variants for personal development and the development of the culture of society. And this optimum is also cognizable. Accordingly, if you master the methodology of cognition and creativity, then this optimum can be identified. And if you master the sufficiently general theory of governance and work out governorial skills, this optimum can be realized in life, moreover, on a global scale. If we talk about the biblical project of globalization, then, if it had been completed by about the end of the 16th century, then we would be living differently, in a different era, in a different culture, and many problems, in the form of a global environmental crisis, the threat of a world war, as the competition of states that think that they are on their own and do not live in the stream of a certain globalization. All this would not have happened.
Угрозы мировой войны, как конкуренции государств, которые думают, что они сами по себе, они живут в русле некой глобализации. Всего бы этого не было. Но
But the world behind the scenes is not the Lord God. Therefore, they were unable to complete the project by the time its completion was safe for the global civilization in the aspect of existence. And the delay caused the fact that factors that were suicidal in relation to the lifestyle that formed this very project came into play. And this circumstance, from the point of view of the adherents of the biblical project, is a great grief, because the project leads to catastrophe. And those who do not like the project of current global civilization, this is an incentive in order to work out and implement an alternative project of globalization. But the situation is such that the Almighty will not do for people what people can and should do themselves.
Why do you think that globalization should have been completed by the 16th century?
By the 16th century, there was no technosphere based on technogenic energy.
How then to deal with globalization if you can go on horseback from Europe to North America or Australia?
And this is again about performance speed. Carriers of an animal type of psyche structure have their own range of interests. They do not delve into themes of politics. The main pleasures are physiological and psychological, and the absence of unpleasantnesses of such kinds. In zombies, new interests are also not born. Therefore, the performance speed of those means of communication, it, in principle, made it possible to maintain the regime of self-governance of the global civilization, but on condition that it was completed by the end of the 16th century. But when the demolition of strata caste systems began, and technogenic energy appeared, then everything that makes globalization suicidal for mankind came into play. Why was the rate lost? Well, the rate was lost due to the fact of the emergence of Christianity. It had to, in some way, be culturalized. Then Muhammad came. He also told what did not fit into this project of globalization. Genghis Khan, well, simply by military forces, blocked the advancement of this globalization in many directions. The pace was lost owing to independent circumstances. The project was not completed on time, and further it turns out that if the project is not completed in the conditions for which it was designed, there was a change in conditions, then the algorithmics of governance that is incorporated in this project turns out to be inadequate. A different algorithmics of governance is required. But within the framework of biblical science and the biblical conception, this algorithmics cannot be produced.
Who is the customer then of biblical globalization?
Questions for ancient Egypt. There, the guys wanted undivided world power in the name of God. Why they wanted it, whether they reached with their minds or fell a victim of temptation, possessions by Iblis Satan, that's another question.
The technosphere contributes to globalization, and if the technosphere is weak enough, then even while, for example, relatively speaking, some distant province rebelled,
Why should it rebel? Let us assume that globalization is completed. In any region of the planet, everyone goes, some on Saturdays to the synagogue, others on Sundays to the church, offering tithes. The Inquisition works everywhere. The cadre politics is carried out stably. If someone lets slip something there, then his prophylactic father's inquisitors will liquidate him as unnecessary. The system is in principle governable.
well, any system fails, and any system gives some errors.
Yes, but errors, failures in that variant are not critical.
The question is why. One failure, and a certain Gaius Julius Caesar rebelled, decided that he would be in charge here.
Gaius Julius Caesar, before he rebelled and decided that he was in charge, someone had to give sanction for Gaius Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great to start doing what they were doing. But if the sanction had been given to strangle in infancy, then there would be no Gaius Julius Caesar and no Alexander the Great. But there was no sanction to strangle in infancy. There was a sanction to turn a blind eye and not interfere. This is not the matter of your competence. And in such a way, in general, in history, everything flows. Because if a conspiracy is organized somewhere, and there is a state and special services, in order for the conspiracy to take place, the special services must turn a blind eye to it or actively participate in the conspiracy, cultivating that which will be after the coup, assigning roles and so on and so forth like Count Palin. Paul tells him, "There is a conspiracy. Yes, your majesty, there is. I head it in order to render it harmless in time." And further, the choice is his. Either all the conspirators go to the guillotine. There was no guillotine in Russia, but they would have found a way to deal with them. Or the conspiracy reaches its logical conclusion, and that which happens happens in history in the form in which we know it. But from the moment states exist and from the moment clans exist that carry an esoteric tradition and carry out behind-the-scenes politics, no Julius Caesar, no Alexander the Great is possible. In order for them to reach the level of functional capability, a sanction is required which will either be given or not given. But if humanity turns out to be culturally united, because the meaning of globalization is to ensure cultural unity, the only question is what this culture will be like. For that era, if the biblical culture became dominant with those means of communication, with those means of transport, then everywhere there could be its own inquisition, and all regions of the planet would self-govern in one single regime. Cultural exchange would not have been so intense as to cause something, But in general, there would have been chances of acquiring a stable culture and further governed development of some technosphere, perhaps reaching the current level of development of the technosphere, but already in one single common culture in which there is no threat of internal wars. The circumstance that all sorts of not controlled by globalizers processes outside of the completely controlled by them region took place, well, it brought down that project of globalization in those conditions in which it was more or less functionally operable.
Why not hold back technological progress if these guys are so powerful? Wait until globalization is over, and then that's it. Let's go.
There are processes of self-governance which are manipulated, and the slowdown of scientific technological progress or its acceleration are also processes that are not dragged by the scruff of the neck. These are processes that are manipulated. You want to accelerate globalization. Here as a variant. The demolition of the caste-strata system, money rules the world, here we go. Further, transition to Marxism. Transition to Marxism on a global scale. After all, Marxism was oriented on the completion of globalization by means of emergency force as a result of what Trotskyism called the World Socialist Revolution. It did not work out.
Why, after all, did it again not work out?
Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin was not a Marxist. What Joseph Vissarionovich wrote in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, and how he developed the system of education in the USSR, this is anti-Marxist activity.
Well, eliminate Joseph Vissarionovich and put another Marxist in his place.
Overlooked, did not have time.
Well, listen, Joseph Vissarionovich ruled the Soviet Union for many years, and he could have been removed many times.
He could have been removed many times, but nonetheless they did not remove him, because, again, the world behind the scenes is not the Lord God, who possesses omnipotence and omniscience. Its capabilities are limited, and people themselves elevate it to the rank of omniscient and omnipotent.
But on the one hand, there are great possibilities. On the other hand, there are big blunders.
Yes, on the one hand, the possibilities are great, but on the other hand, they are limited. And outside the boundaries of competence and performance speed, a lot of things can happen that can nullify the result of the activity. But the question ultimately boils down to whether a person wants to be a human, or whether it's sufficient for him to be in that social role which someone in the intrasocial hierarchy imposes on him.
In my opinion, until they explain to him, he will not reach this by thinking. These are very rare exceptions.
Yes, very rare exceptions. So, people in whom the parents and culture could not suppress their совесть and will, they can reach it by thinking.
And the rest are all just floating in the general stream.
The rest are all floating in the general stream. But choice, ultimately, after all, is with each of them.
But there is no choice for people at all.
Yes, there is.
Well, theoretically there is.
The possibility to stop, to think, it always is. Another thing is how this possibility to stop and think will be realized. The circumstances press them so that they will have to stop and think, or in some situation, a person will see that this mess is unacceptable for a person and will say that it's impossible to live like this any longer, and an alternative way of life should be worked out.
Well, it usually happens that a person loses faith in some system, as it was with us during the late Soviet Union. He goes to something else. Accordingly, where does he go? Into religion. In religion, he's been spinning for 10, 15, 20 years.
Well, there are many traps in the world. After all, culture is built purpose consonantly in relation to the task of preventing a person from taking place as a human, and not allowing people to build a civilization of humanness on the planet.
Well, so I say that there is no choice for people. They are factually from one trap to another.
People have a choice, but a person very often does not want to use this choice, because if there is information, further the question arises about accepting responsibility for something other than himself. And to accept responsibility even for oneself, the main mass is formed by the culture in such a way that it does not want to do this.
Well, it turns out to be a hopeless situation.
This is not a hopeless situation. It is a slowly flowing process.
By the time it reaches the end, we'll have long been globalized 10 times.
Again, globalization is variative. And if everything were so simple, and indeed the world behind the scenes had all-seeingness and almightiness, it would have globalized long ago, even at the latest, by the beginning of the 16th century.
Well, maybe they have completely different time periods. If they live for 1,000 years, well, whatever, we were a little mistaken for 100 years. We will correct it in the next 100 years. As for us, correcting in the next month.
Yes, the only question is that unpredictable factors can emerge. After all, you see, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, there is the concept of stability of an object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance as such. And in the West, an alternative concept is introduced, which is defined through the metaphor black swan. The black swan is an unpredictable event that brings down all previously made plans. As for us, we have a creative task. Therefore, the question is raised about the stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior. And their task is to protect their project from unpredictable factors that can bring it down. That is, this is already a psychologically defensive position, which ultimately presupposes collapse. Because black swans are, by definition, unpredictable. Moreover, again, if we correlate with the sufficiently general theory of governance, then the sufficiently general theory of governance, in its logics, is, after all, a religious teaching. That is, it is a doctrine, one of the aspects of which is the interrelationship between the personality governor and the Most High. And in the SGTG, one of the points to which special attention is drawn is the fact that if you take a certain particular process under governance, then you should be concerned in advance that the completion of this process will belong to a certain encompassing process that will exist at the time of completion and which will be acceptable for you. This task in the SGTG is posed, but it lies outside the organization of governance according to the entire function towards those processes that you undertake. And in the end, this task is solved intuitively. Intuition works correctly when a person's will and psyche are subordinated to sovest. Sovest is an innate religious sense that always, clearly and alternatively, delimits between what is dobro and what is evil. Therefore, the question of the prevention of black swans in governorial practice on the basis of the sufficiently general theory of governance in principle does not arise. And for the West, only metaphors change. After all, you see, the metaphors of the black swan are an achievement of recent decades. And what came before it? And before that, there was the monkey's paw effect, 1950s. But the meaning is the same. You do something, and this something is accompanied by an unpredictable for you, unacceptable side effect, which either devalues the achieved result or makes it, in principle, unacceptable for you. In Russian language, on this theme, there is only one saying. Moreover, it is of an ironic character. That which we fought against, by that we were impaled.
This happens simply due to the mistakes in planning and in setting of objectives.
Yes, but mistakes in planning and setting of objectives, they are conditioned by the fact that intuition either does not work or works not under the control of Sophist. Now, if everything is correct in the aspects of setting of objectives and planning, the process flows governably. Yes, of course, there are some inaccuracies in planning, there are inaccuracies in governance. But the accompanying error of governance, it will be such that the achieved result will not be worse, but better than it was planned. But this is possible only in one single case. If governance is carried out in the stream of providence, and accordingly, Sophist does not sleep, and all the psychic activity of an individual governor is subject to Sophist. But if Sophist is a certain abstraction that can be understood this way or that way, and not something that is present in the psyche and recognizable in one's own psyche, well then, yes, then this is a debatable question. Not everything is predictable. Planning errors are inevitable, but statistically often, for some reason, these errors are such that they make the result either worse than expected or completely unacceptable.
That is, our so-called world behind the scenes still cannot really accomplish this globalization finally. Well, in general, it is successfully moving towards the final stage. Despite its mistakes, it's moving. So they have every chance to complete it. Well, not now. Well, there will be a couple more mistakes.
If we allow it to be completed, yes. And if we do not allow it, then no. And how to complete it? I say that a menu of several varieties of global catastrophe is offered to choose from. Biological degradation in satiety of the European type.
Well, this is impossible.
Why?
Well, because at the European level of consumption, someone has to work.
Yes, someone should work for a symbolic payment. Someone should be burnt out in the economy as a resource.
So it won't be satiety.
There will be no death from satiety, at least on a global scale. But Europe and America could collapse with the replacement of their indigenous population by carriers of many cultures. Further, technogenic catastrophes. If by some miracle there are no technogenic catastrophes, then the development of the technosphere, the collapse of the current biosphere, and then, further, again something. Well, or the most evil variant, an accidentally emerging nuclear war, an unplanned one.
Well, the collapse of the biosphere is not the end of the existence of mankind, because with such scientific technological progress, relatively speaking, and these fantasy films are shown to us, It is enough to insert the brain into some cyber-organic body, and you only have to replace prosthesis.
Well, this is also, let's say, a debatable question. Everything is easily done on a cinema platform, but if we move on to practice, then this will not be in the next 20 years.
While in the next 100 years.
Well, maybe, but you see, this is already a different civilization. This is the civilization of cyborgs. But all the same, the question of brains arises because any technique is more primitive than what we have under the cranial vault.
That's what I'm saying, brains in the box.
But brains have to be produced somewhere. Biotechnology and so on. But you see, this is again not our problem. This is the problem of those who think about this theme and are trying to organize funding.
So they already came up with something. Quite recently, I read that they have grown an artificial brain for experiments.
It may also take shape in such a way that the collapse of the biosphere will be such that there will be no one to be engaged in it. Because the collapse of the biosphere, well, here's a simple question. Let's say bees disappeared under the impact of GMOs or mobile television networks spreading everywhere. What further? Probably more than half of the flora will disappear. First flora and then fauna, because for many plant species, bees are the alternativeless pollinator. The biosphere is much more fragile than the layman is accustomed to thinking. What does the layman think? Goes out into nature, leaves a pigsty. Next time he goes to another place, it turns out that others left a pigsty. He doesn't have enough brains to think about the fact that you need to clean up after yourself. Then questions arise. Where does oncology come from? Where does the tainted vodka come from, which killed all the participants in a picnic? But precisely from there, the biosphere is reasoning and closes feedback lines on the theme either think or perish.
Well, for some reason, the uppermost, in the upper echelons, are somehow the most dangerous, but they somehow do not go anywhere.
The question is of a different kind. Here is Ukraine nearby. If we remove the system of governance in a super system that is not capable of governing with a higher quality, then there will be a lot of disasters. Because if you look at what is happening in Ukraine, this is not the most difficult variant of the catastrophe. Poroshenko and the Verkhovna Rada are still twitching there and trying somehow to steer. Some public institutions like the police, the security service of Ukraine are still working. There is still no walk field and wars of all against all, but it is possible. With the further aggravation of the catastrophe, this is possible. And in general, it turns out that whichever governance there is, in some cases it is preferable to the liquidation of the historically taken shape governance. Because the consequences of the destruction of governance may turn out to be more severe than the consequences of the current incorrect governance, and whichever kind of work there is for the transformation of society as an object of governance, and on the transformation of statehood as a system of governance towards this society. So let's again go back to historical parallels. After the abolition of serfdom, the Romanovs were able to bring Russia to the collapse of culture. Japan has developed in many ways in worse conditions. Well, there the only such serious mistake is its participation in the Second World War on the wrong side. But if we talk about the consequences of the 1917 revolution, we have not yet overcome them. We still have a defective demographic pyramid. It looks not like a pyramid, but like a Christmas tree.
Она похожа не на пирамиду, а на елку. Вот. У нас много
We have a lot of things in terms of working out the meaning of life for the future, hovering in states of non-determinacies,
состояниях неопределенности. И много чего
and a lot of things in terms of comprehension of our own history. Japan has dealt with these problems so far. By the way, there is also such an interesting thing that the Japanese have refused to teach sociology, politology, and other sciences at their universities. They gave it up without any declarations.
Вот. Они
Therefore,
отказались от этого.
a certain number of European educated intellectuals have arisen there who are against this. But if you look at the essence of the matter, European sociology, European politology, these are generators of problems, not means of solving them. If we assume that the pseudo-Jurets clans of Japan simply restore the sovereignty of Japan by default, after all they had their own treatises on the theme of how to govern the state. And these treatises are more ancient than, say, the Sovereign of Machiavelli. If we assume this, then Japan, quietly, without declarations, is engaged in the restoration of its sovereignty.
Без деклараций занимается восстановлением своего суверенитета. Ну, в былые
Well, in bygone times, in 1993, Urmas Ott, the now deceased television presenter, first of the Soviet Union, and then of Estonia and Russia, interviewed the former Prime Minister of Japan, Yasuhiro Nakasone. He asked him, "What do you think is the most important thing you did as Prime Minister?" Yasuhiro Nakasone simply answered him, "I created an institute for the study of global problems." That is, Japan started pondering on globalization back then. Yes, it does not explain what it is doing. The politics is carried out according to the principle, he who knows, he will understand, and he who does not know or did not understand, these are his problems. Further, the only question is how this Institute for the Study of Global Problems will work. Because there are two variants. It will provide objective information about these global problems, and objective information about possible ways and methods of solving these global problems. Then in Japan there will arise what was called at the very beginning global politics. Either it will work in the mode of the institution of Marxism-Leninism under the Central Committee of the CPSU, that is, it will scientificize the nonsense ordered by its higher politicians, leading the country to catastrophe. Now, if the Institute for the Study of Global Problems of Japan works in the first variant, then Japan will not make serious mistakes, and it will evolutionarily evolve, increasing the quality of life of both the Japanese themselves and those who copy Japanese technologies of governance, organization. Well, if the Institute for the Study of Global Problems will work in the mode of adjusting to the dogmas of what is happening in the world, well, Japan will make another mistake, compared with which its defeat in the Second World War will be simply an insignificant stumbling block.
If Japan somehow builds its global politics, it is a too small state to influence the entire Earth.
The question is not whether it is numerous or not. The question is how to influence. Now, if you cognize the objective laws of these six groups and give out recommendations on how to resolve the problems arising as a result of violation of these objective laws, then you can be a very small country and demonstrate in your life that yes, our recommendations work, and become a leader of civilizational development. Moreover, if you look, for a long time Japan has not been engaged in development of its fundamental science. They simply copied science, adopted education, adopted technologies of inventions, and so on and so forth, and implemented it at home. But the fact that Japan refused Euro-American style humanitarian education at universities, this is a wake-up call on the theme that Japan will have its own fundamental science, which it will develop. Because the Japanese have investments in this fundamental science, well, at the least, in the course of the time since the USSR ceased to exist. The Japanese invest in fundamental science precisely by the state and corporations, and they have no ravings on the theme that everything should be profitable and fundamental science should work on the principle of self-sufficiency.
But this is just one of the ways to pour banana oil so that science does not develop.
Yes, this is one of the ways to pour banana oil. But when they start to pour this banana oil, a direct counter-question is also possible. So are you healthy in your mind, or do you take us as morons? When the market reforms began, no one in the Soviet Union asked these questions, all the more so in a convincing form, because there had been no discussions at party congresses since the beginning of perestroika. There was no glasnost as such since the beginning of perestroika. There was blatant propaganda of liberalism, and everything that did not coincide with this was gagged and suppressed. Because even if you recall the innocent article by Nina Andreeva, the reaction was hysterical and convulsive. That is, what Gorbachev feared most of all was a truly free, all-people discussion about the problems of the development of the country.
What is this article?
I cannot compromise my principles, an article by Nina Andreeva. She caused hysteria on the part of perestroika activists because they blatantly lied. Well, to make it clear, how did de-Stalinization begin during perestroika? We remembered a certain Raskolnikov, who died in France being a Soviet diplomat defector, and his letter to Stalin on the theme of how Stalin rooted out the Leninist Guard. Well, now let's see who Raskolnikov is. Raskolnikov, in principle, is a dropout. During the First World War, he studied to become an officer in the Navy, and Raskolnikov commanded the operation that resulted in two destroyers, Spartak and Avtrail, being captured by the British and handed over to the Estonians. Raskolnikov himself, as the British write, they found in the provision pantry, disguised as a simple sailor, with documents in a false name. The documents were in the name of an Estonian, but since Raskolnikov did not speak Estonian, he could not confirm that he was the one for whom the documents were. More than 100 people from the crews of Spartak and Avtrail were shot after being held in a concentration camp. Raskolnikov lived in London for some time and then returned. If we correlate this matter with the traditions of the Russian fleet, then, after this operation, Raskolnikov should have been shot for war crimes. The surrender of ships to opponents without a fight. This is one of the authorities who was involved in starting de-Stalinization during the years of perestroika.
There were a lot of oddities there.
There were a lot of oddities there, but it was not accidental. It was purpose-oriented politics in which there was a certain behind-the-scenes component.
That is, the Soviet Union was supposed to collapse.
The Soviet Union was sentenced to liquidation because the Trotskyists of the second generation of the Khrushchev era, in general, they were already consumers and not revolutionaries, and could not ensure the export of the world revolution to other countries.
Well, the Soviet Union was brought down for a long time.
They were in no hurry. This is the Overton window technology. Because if it was brought down quickly, a reaction is possible. That is, one of the generals will quickly speak, quickly react. He will quickly shoot whoever is needed, and what then? The question is open. But the technology of the Overton window, when slowly changing, it allows you to achieve a result without excesses, although it takes a lot of time. Therefore, first the ceremonial funeral of the murdered Stalin, then the murder of Beria and his elevation to the rank of enemy of the people, then the 20th Congress, then the pseudo-cult of Brezhnev's personality, like a caricature of the personality cult of Stalin, then everyone comes to the conclusion that it is impossible to live like this. Gorbachev appears, I know how to live, and the Union is led to the final collapse, and no one to resist except for a few.
Well, then it turns out that the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. If we bring down the Soviet Union, which could not ensure the export of the world revolution, then the United States will become the main. And there they are not for their revolution. There they have consumption, and they become the main ones.
They become the main ones, but they are also sentenced. Because after the propaganda center of socialism ceased to exist, and the liberal market economic model generates a lot of problems of a global character, the United States is also not needed. And if you look at how the economy of the United States is developing after 1991, then, in general, it is not very much developing. Technologies are being withdrawn, infrastructures are maintained in a minimal working order. For some reason, coffins are being prepared, concentration camps are being built, and a lot of things are happening there, about which, in general, it is not customary to talk too much. Yes, there remains a certain high-tech, in the sense of scientific, methodological support for high-tech, which is carried out to other countries. So far, the states have a higher level of consumption. But if there is a catastrophe in the states, then all the brains can be taken to China. As luck would have it, ghost towns are being built in China, which are not inhabited by anyone. But in general, all the brains in excess can be removed from the states in about 2 weeks. There are already films on the theme of evacuation from the states. In general, this is the preparation of the deep psychological levels of the psyche of the American layman. Because in case of such a possibility, the necessary automatisms formed in the cinema would be involved and would work.
What will happen next?
The future is multivariate. Even this variant is not obligatory. Because much is determined by the position of Russia. If Russia takes on the mission of solving global problems and rolls out its project of globalization, which relies on the six groups of objective laws to which the life of society is subordinate, then we resolve our crisis in passing and become the leader of civilizational development. Everyone else will just join.
After the collapse of the United States, the need for such a strong Russia is also unnecessary.
But globalization is an objective process. The conceptions of globalization are subjective. If we roll out our project of globalization, this project of globalization is life consistent in all six groups of objective laws to which the life of society and the life of every person are subordinated. You can't get away from it. It will be realized.
If it contradicts the idea of the globalizers, it will not be allowed to be realized.
But again, we already spoke about this. The designs of globalizers and their capabilities are limited. They are not the almighty. The noospheric objective laws are such that those who persist in implanting evil will get very unlucky when they come across someone who insists on the truth. Precisely from this stem the words of Alexander Nevsky: God is not in might, but in truth.
Well, let's hope that, after listening to you, some people will ponder not only on their own lives, but also about the problems of globalization and geopolitics.
Someone will ponder on it, someone will write again in the comments. Well, society is what it is, and we must take it as it is. All the best.